Here. I think it stopped. Many of you know Henry Ford is the founder and president of the Ford Motor Company. But did you know Henry Ford was fascinated with watch repair? Henry learned at an early age of 13 how to take watches apart and fix them, and repaired them throughout his entire career as the president of Ford Motor Company. Henry was a curious young man fascinated with machinery, and I'm going to talk about his path to the creation of Ford Motor Company, the use of innovation to fine-tune the assembly line, and the interest in antiques, which led to the creation of the Greenfield and Henry Ford museums, becoming a curator of history. My sources for my speech are an article from the Salem Press Biographical Encyclopedia on Henry Ford by Jay Hardy. I used two books from the Millersville University, the first being The Henry Ford, The Wayward Capitalist by Carol Gelderman. Also, The Legend of Henry Ford by Keith Sword. And finally, an article by Bob Casey on Henry Ford, the founder of the Ford Motor Company. Bob Casey was a former curator of the Henry Ford Museum. Henry Ford was born in 1863 in Dearborn, Michigan, on a family farm. Of course, he had a curiosity for machinery. On a trip to Detroit with his father, they came upon a man running a self-propelled vehicle with a steam engine, and Henry Ford was fascinated by this vehicle. And so he was interested in making his own vehicle, and he decided to learn the skills by going off and getting jobs in the different fields he needed to know, such as steam and propulsion. He wasn't much on school. He pretty much took notes, simple notes, and didn't keep a diary. So that was it for him. He headed off to school, from school at the age of 16. In 1882, he took on a job at the Detroit Dock Works, where they service ships, and he learned how to work on both steam engines and the internal combustion engine. Then in 1882, he headed off to Westinghouse, and Westinghouse made portable steam engines for sawing wood and threshing of grain. And he went all over Michigan servicing and repairing these engines. And he decided then that that's about the time he wanted to build his first self-propelled vehicle. Then in 1888, he met and married his wife Clara, and she was amazed by him, his mechanical ability. She would watch him for hours out in the fields using a tractor that he built. And then in 1893, two things happened. They had their only son, Edsel Ford, and in his quest to learn how to build his own vehicle, he needed to know more about electricity. So he headed off to the Edison Illuminating Company and became their chief engineer. And while he was there, living in that house, he had a small coal shed out back. And then he set up his shop there and started experimenting with his own vehicle. During that time there, he went to a convention where Thomas Edison himself was there, and Henry wanted to know if Thomas Edison thought there was any future in the internal combustion engine. And so he asked Thomas Edison what he thought, if the engine was possible, and Thomas Edison is quoted as saying, "Yes, there's a big future for any lightweight internal combustion engine that can develop high horsepower and is self-contained. And he continued by saying, keep on with your engine. If you can get what you are after, can see a great future. So Henry, of course, was thrilled with that. He and Thomas Edison became good friends and did many things together over their lifetimes. 3 years later, in 1896, Henry completed his first car. It was called the quadricycle. It had a small internal combustion engine in the back there, had 4 bicycle wheels, and Henry drove that around town to and from work, and he had to lock it up to hitching posts because he was afraid people were going to steal it. So Henry wants to take this thing out of his shop, and he's excited, and he wants to take it for a spin, and he goes in the shop, and he realizes that, one, the car is too big to fit through the door. So what does Henry Ford do? Henry Ford picks up an axe and begins to knock the wall out to get his car out. So he gets the car out, and he takes his wife and son for a ride around the neighborhood. And that was pretty much the beginning of the Ford Motor Company. So moving ahead to the Model T, the Model T was a great success. He could neither build enough of them or build them fast enough. So when they first started, they built the cars in a stationary position, one laid out, and they would build one car at a time. And they realized that that was not going to work because they had to turn out more of them. So Henry and his engineers came up with an assembly line. Now they started with a rope at first, and they pulled the cars along. And they would build the cars that went along, but the problem with that early attempt was parts were laying all over the floor. And people were tripping over the piles of parts, and it wasn't very efficient. So he and the engineers went back to work, and it took them 7 years, but they ended up using a conveyor system that not only moved the cars along, but it brought parts in by conveyor to different points of the assembly line, making it more efficient. To the point where Henry was able to build 40,000 cars a year, and he knocked the price down from $950 a piece down to $450 a piece, thereby making his car more affordable for the common man. So this huge enterprise caused Henry to become an industrialist because he's mass producing a huge amount of cars. And by the end of 1927, they had built 15 million Model Ts. So that's a lot. Also, the work on the assembly line was hard and monotonous work. It was back-breaking work. They worked 9 hours a day for about $2.70 a day. And the turnover was high. He would have to hire 53,000 workers to fill 14,000 positions a year. That's a lot of people. And because of that high turnover, the quality of his cars was not the best. So he also realized that his workers were not living well. Many times, because of the low wages, family members such as wives and children were having to work as well. And because of that, he had unions knocking on the door, trying to get into his company and run it and tell him, dictate policy for him. Henry Ford wasn't going to have any of that. So Henry Ford announced the $5 day. And by doing that, he was able to raise the standard of living for his employees. It allowed them to buy the very product that they were building, which gave his company and the area surrounding companies prosperity. And he gave him more skilled workers because he had a bigger pick of people. But he developed loyal workers as well because everybody was afraid to lose their $5 a day job. So it made them loyal. One of the final things that Henry Ford was really interested in was his childhood home and history of America. And he decided at one point that he was going to restore his childhood home. And word got out through his dealer network that he wanted to do this. And so people all across the United States started scouring their attics for antiques and began sending them to them. So these antiques began to show up in boxcars on the railroad. And Henry had to put them someplace, so he put them on in a warehouse on his property. And he decided that with all those antiques, that he was going to make a monument to Americana. So he began drawing up plans to build a museum, and at the time it was called the Greenfield Village. And in the early times it had the Edison Museum with the antiques. It had the Edison Institute because Henry was interested in education, and so he actually ran a school system there. And of course the Greenfield Village, which was a reproduction of a small American town, that he had small buildings brought in from all over the country, had them disassembled and brought in. Today, the museum is called the Henry Ford Museum of Innovation, and you can drive a Model T. You can see the huge display of American history. You can see the Rouge Ford assembly plant and see an assembly line in work, in progress. And you can tour the village. So, in conclusion, from his humble beginnings as a farmer's son, he was able to gain the knowledge he needed to become an innovator, build his first car, start his first car company, build a car. He used innovation to make that process better. He became an industrialist while mass producing the Model T. And he was a curator of American history by starting a museum. Thank you.